Major funding for these programs is made possible by grants from Chase Commercial Term Lending and Capital One Bank, New York Community Bank, the Witkoff Group, M&T Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Genova Burns, Jean Tomasi and Webster, Greenberg Traurig, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company. Additional funding is provided by grants from AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Colliers International NYC, CPEX Real Estate Services, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, First Nationwide Title Agency, Flushing Bank, Friedman, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, Hap Investment Developers, Herrick Feinstein, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Chairman USRealty.com, John Katsimides, Red Apple Group, Margolin Weiner and Evans, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Matone Group, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, Newbanks, People's United Bank, SJP Properties, Sterling & Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the CUNY TV Foundation, the Continuum Company, Urban American, and these friends.
So some people grow up, they're born in Washington Heights, they move to Great Neck, they go to Kentucky, then they go to this college called Harvard, and then they have this premonition, that maybe I want to be a clown. Maybe I'll go to Ringling Bros, I'll be a clown. Then they say, nah, forget being a clown, I'll go to Tanzania. And then it's medical school. And for medical school's too easy, so I have to get a PhD in a combination, and then Columbia, and a variety of places. And now I have a guy who is the chief medical officer and the senior vice president at the Montefiore Health System, Montefiore Medical Center, Dr. Andy Racine. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me. This is a pleasure.
So tell me about your grandparents. You were telling me one was a tailor, French tailor. Tell me a little bit about.
Well, actually, on both sides of the family, the grandfathers were in the garment industry. My grandfather on my mother's side had a small business of his own, and on my father's side, my great-grandfather was a tailor, high-end tailor.
Was it your grandparents who came over, or their parents came over?
So on my mother's side, it was my grandparents. On my father's side, it was his grandfather who came over, and his mother. So it depended on which.
And that was the side with the Paris, the tailoring.
So my father's father,
fine tailoring.
My father's father was born in Paris.
So they come over. Where did they live when they came to America?
So that's an interesting story. My grandparents on my mother's side lived on the not really the Lower East Side, but let's say 11th Street, Avenue B. I don't know what you'd call East Village now.
East Village.
Right, that's where they lived when they first came. And then they later, when they got a little bit more resources, moved to the Bronx, which is where my mother was born. And my father's parents actually were in St. Louis, which is where he was born, and only later moved to New York.
Which was the question? How did they end up in St.
Louis? I don't know the answer to that. Part of the reason for that is that my grandfather, my father's father, died when I was very young. So a lot of the history of that family is lost. I don't really know it.
So your parents come here. You told me, I think your mother went to Evangel Childs?
Yes, she did.
And then she went to Hunter College?
Correct.
And your father?
She went to college with Bell Abzug. And my father never graduated from college. He did 3 years at Fordham, but then couldn't afford to continue, had to go to work.
Now, you told me that your parents met at Hearns, you believe, one of the department stores, And how they met was they were having, let's say, a jurisdictional question because they work for two different departments, or
Yes.
at least departments.
Yes, my mother tells this story much better than I could ever do.
Yeah, but since your mother's alive, try to tell the story. What
Well, the story was that she was a buyer for women's blouses, I believe, and my father was a buyer for women's skirts. And they had floor space next to one another. She had done some great deal where she managed to buy all of these either blouses or sweaters, I don't know which ones, and she needed more space to display them, and so she kind of preemptively took over some of his space. And when he found out about it, he was furious, and there was a big argument about it. They went to their boss, and it finally got amicably resolved, but they met in a dispute.
And then they subsequently were married. And
They were subsequently married.
And your parents, when they first got married, because where you were born, they lived up in Washington Heights, right? On
They
Capri.
did. So I have a sister who's, she'll forgive me for telling you this, she's a year older than I am. She was born first. And then within about 12 months, I was born. We were both this was a 2-bedroom apartment in Washington Heights. And then when I was about 3.5, we moved out of the city.
So you moved to Great Neck.
Correct.
And so tell me about growing up in Great Neck, and this is Great Neck in the...
Mid-50s.
Right. So tell
Late
me-
50s, early 60s, mid-60s. From the standpoint of my parents, and I'm speaking for them now since they're not telling the story themselves, I think it was really an enormous accomplishment from the standpoint of what their backgrounds were. They were moving out of the city. This was a huge thing for them. And they moved into a community of like-minded people who were either young professionals or young business people of their same vintage, of their same background. And they formed a very, very tight-knit, long-standing community. My mother is still very much in touch with women who are the survivors in that community to this day. From the standpoint of being a child, it was really, in some ways, an idyllic place. It was safe. It was easy to get around on a bicycle. You had friends in the neighborhood that you could hang out with and play with. The schools were great.
So you said you knew that you liked children and you liked social studies. How do you get this propensity towards social studies and other...
Right.
No,
Right, so my academic interests in high school were like a lot of people's. It was very eclectic. We had to take courses in everything that was not, you didn't specialize in high school in this country. As we may talk about, I'm married to someone who grew up outside the United States where you were really asked to specialize quite early. But in my education, that was not the case. So yes, I enjoyed social studies, I enjoyed science, I enjoyed math, I liked all of it. And my interest in children is something that is very difficult to pin down in terms of when it originated. I do know that early on during the summers when I was no longer going to camp on my own, a lot of my activities were involved in supervisory activities with other children, lifeguarding, teaching swimming.
Now,
that sort of
when you were in high school, is that when you got involved with blood banking?
Yes, toward the later end of my high school was a
How did you decide to get involved with blood banking?
I had a friend who was a year or so older than I was, who was doing this work at Long Island Jewish. It paid really well, and it was a nice opportunity to make some money in the summer. Actually, when I did that, I was working 2 jobs because I worked there, which was a paying job, and I was also volunteering at the psychiatric hospital, Hillside, which is right next door to LIJ, as you know. And so I had the chance to earn some money in the blood bank and gain some clinical lab skills, but also to learn a little bit about psychiatric work.
Now, what were you doing at the psychiatric hospital?
I was an aide.
Did you think that you might have had a desire to get involved with psychiatry at that time?
Well, to me, it was very illuminating, and I learned a lot about patient care, and I learned a lot about how to work in teams with people. But I was not really thinking about psychiatry as a career. It was just really an opportunity to gain some clinical experience that was close at hand.
So how did you get the Head Start in Kentucky?
So there was a program that I had heard about. It must have been my parents who actually told me about it. I don't remember now, called the Encampment for Citizenship. It was one of these sort of left-wing organizations that took children from a variety of different places in the country, actually, and organized them into public service encampments, if you will, for the summer. So this was in eastern Kentucky. They had other ones, other parts of the country, but I was particularly interested in going there. And there were people, as I say, from all parts of the country. The person I actually lived with was a Hopi Indian from Arizona. And it got you the opportunity to meet people from all over the states. And when you got there, you had the opportunity to choose among a variety of different kinds of activities that you might be interested in. And because of this sort of temperamental proclivity to working with children, I gravitated toward their Head Start program. And I worked in a Head Start program in Breathitt County, in Jackson.
Now, this was in your junior year of high school?
This was 1967, so it was really my freshman year of high school.
Did you go back to Kentucky, or you did this for 1 year?
I did it for 1 year.
So you graduate Great Neck South, and you decide...
Thank you, by the way, for making that distinction. It's very important to me.
I know. How did you decide that you wanted to travel up to Boston to go to Harvard?
Again, I had a friend who was a couple of years older than me in college who had decided that he was going to do that. His older brother had gone there. He went there. He was someone I admired a great deal and I liked a lot. And I had the opportunity to visit him a little bit when I was in high school. It seemed like a great place to learn, and so that's really what...
So let's talk about those 4 years in Cambridge and Boston.
Okay.
Tell me about going to Harvard.
So Harvard was then and still is an extraordinary place, as you can imagine. From the standpoint of someone who's going there wide-eyed with a lot of intellectual curiosity, it's like someone setting a table in front of you with everything you could possibly want to eat. And then the decision is, well, what do you pick and choose among, and how do you do that?
And how do you not gouge yourself?
And how do you not gouge yourself? And I actually depended upon this friend of mine, actually, for a lot of guidance. He was great with regard to that. He was, by that time, a junior when I got there as a freshman. So he and his roommates had been through a bunch of the different courses that they found interesting and stimulating. They gave me some advice with regard to that, and that was particularly helpful for me. That's how I ended up majoring in social studies. It was, in a sense, through their advising.
So you're majoring in social studies, but you're also thinking that you want to go to medicine at this time.
Right, and the decision to go to medicine was made late. What I did was, Harvard had a bunch of distribution requirements. You actually had to take a certain amount of science, a certain amount of humanities. So that the science part of it, I really took just the bare minimum of courses that you would need in order to apply to medical school. Things are very different now than it was then. Now you really have to build up much more, I think, of a portfolio of scientific activity. But in those days, if you did the basic requirements and you were interested and you had some other things going, you could apply. And so I decided that having taken the courses that were necessary, I was trying to decide between going to graduate school and going to medical school. And after some conversations with some graduate students whom I knew, I decided that this would be the better option for me.
Either your junior or senior year, and you think of going to the famous, because it is, the Ringling Brothers, Barnum Bailey Circus Clown School.
Yes.
Talk to me about that. Your parents must have said...
They were thrilled. You can't imagine. My mother, she could go to her friends, talk about her son the clown. No, didn't quite work out like that. It was, I thought, I wanted to take off some time between college and medical school. I had been in school for a while by that time. Gap years weren't de rigueur the way they are now, but people were doing it. And I thought this would be a great way to see the United States. You'd get to work with a bunch of really interesting people. You'd get to work with children, and it would be fun. You get to perform, which was something that I thought would be fun as well.
Now, the only problem was when it started, it didn't coincide with an academic year, right?
That's right. So the school, the clown school then, I don't know now, ran from November to December. And if you did well at graduation, they offered you a contract that ran from January to January, which would have meant I needed to take off 2 years. And that was really more at the time than I was contemplating doing.
So as opposed to clown school, how do you end up in Tanzania, Africa?
Right. So this was because I was particularly interested in some of the social experimentation that was going on in that country at that time. The President, Julius Nyerere, was working on an arrangement that he called ujamaa, which essentially is Swahili for familyhood, but it was his notion of an indigenous African socialism and how it would be executed in a country that had a multi-ethnic base, that was a relatively peaceful place, and that could really spearhead what would be a different way of developing, not necessarily along Western lines, not necessarily along the Eastern Bloc lines, but someplace that would be indigenously African. And I thought this would be a very interesting thing to see. I also anticipated that it might be a nice opportunity to work a little bit in medicine before I went to medical school. And all of those things turned out to be the case. It was a transformative experience.
And you spent 1 year.
I spent a year there. I then went back 2 years later to work in a public health project there.
So you had been accepted. How do you decide to go to NYU School of Medicine and go for a PhD at the same time?
So those were two separate decisions. I went to NYU because they accepted me, and I thought it would be a good place to train in New York City. And as it turns out, the clinical training there was taking place really at the exact time that the HIV and tuberculosis epidemics were emerging in New York. We didn't know it then. We were treating, as students, we were encountering lots of people with very unusual wasting diseases, lymphadenopathy, unusual infections, particularly on the prison ward at Bellevue Hospital. It turned out to be wonderful clinical training. The issue about doing a PhD in economics, I didn't find out about actually until I got to NYU and learned that their MD PhD program actually set aside certain slots for people who wanted to do the PhD in the social sciences. Most people were doing them in the biologic sciences, but they had a couple of slots. There was one person ahead of me who had done it in economics. There was someone else who did it in clinical psychology. And so I applied to do it in economics, and it turned out to be a very worthwhile.
So you do 2 years of medical school.
So I did 2 years of coursework in medicine, 2 years of coursework for the PhD. I came back and did the clinical year in medicine, then went off to do my dissertation.
And your dissertation was on the workman's compensation system.
It was on the origins of workman's compensation, that's right.
But you originally had another idea, as you said to me. One was with regard to deaths, right?
Right. So what I was really interested in was the decline in infectious disease mortality in Great Britain at the end of the 19th century. And in order to study that, I was going to use a specific city, Oldham, in the Midlands, and I was going to go and get death certificates from there and do some work with regard to both the economics of that area at the time and also the patterns of disease and death. And I chose Great Britain, A, because it was an English-speaking country, and also because their vital statistics were as complete and comprehensive as they are. But it turns out that when I went, the year I went there, Margaret Thatcher was elected as Prime Minister, and one of the early decisions she made was to, I suppose for revenue purposes, gain money by charging people access to death certificates. So even though every death certificate in the entire country of Great Britain was sitting really blocks away from where I was working, I couldn't actually access them without paying for each death certificate.
So you felt workers' compensation was a
second best alternative.
Now you finish that, and then you go for your residency, once again returning to Massachusetts.
Right. My brother-in-law, Will Treem, married to my sister, had actually done his residency at the Children's Hospital, and he really enjoyed it, loved it, and he got terrific training. So I thought, this is a good idea, and if they'll have me, I'll go there. So it's a match, just like it is now. And I was fortunate enough to get to go.
So you finished your residency, and then where do you now decide to get involved with Columbia?
Right. So by this time, Kathleen and I had married. She had come back from Europe and was living in New York and got a very nice job there. And so the decision that we were trying to come to terms with was whether it would make more sense for her to move to Boston and for me to stay there from a career standpoint, or for me to come to New York. And Kathleen just got a terrific job in New York, and it didn't make sense for her to leave that. So I came to New York and got a job at Columbia in their General Pediatrics division, working for Nick Cunningham, who was their Chief of General Pediatrics, and for Matty Irigoyen, who was his associate.
So you were
I was a general pediatrician, seeing patients in Washington Heights. And then I also had the opportunity at the same time to get to work at the National Bureau of Economic Research, which was key for my own career in terms of my research. When I first came back to New York, I was actually finishing my last draft on my dissertation. And at the time, the Department of Economics of NYU was in the old, the Bottom Line, that building on the corner of 3rd Street. And down the hall from us was the New York offices of the NBER. And a mutual friend introduced me to a fellow by the name of Ted Joyce, who was a young up-and-coming researcher at the NBER, who is really one of the great health economists in the city. And I got to know Ted, and he was kind enough to let me work with him on some of the projects that he was doing, and we did some interesting work together. So I was working at Columbia doing my clinical work, and I was getting to go downtown to the bureau to work with Ted on
for your economic
research.
work.
Yeah.
So how do you leave Columbia and go to Montefiore?
At the time, there was a combined Department of Pediatrics between the municipal hospital system, Jacoby and North Central Bronx, and the Montefiore system. Michael Cohen was the chairman of the department, and Ruth Stein was the head of pediatrics at Jacoby. And Dr. Stein called me up and asked would I be interested in coming at least to think about the possibility of working as her assistant, which I thought would be interesting. So I went and spoke with her. She made a very compelling case. It was a very interesting place to work. And so I went and did that. Several years after that, the agreement between the municipal hospital system and Montefiore fell apart. And at that time, Dr. Cohen offered the faculty a choice. Either we could, for those of us who wanted, stay within the municipal system, or for those who wanted, come to Montefiore. So this was 1998, and that's when I came over to Montefiore to be the chief of general pediatrics.
Fast forward to 2012, right?
Right.
So from 98 to 2012, your role at Montefiore was what?
I was the chief of the Division of General Pediatrics, which meant that I was in charge of 2 very large faculty practices that taught residents ambulatory pediatrics and delivered care to people both right at the Moses campus, and also we had another practice in the East Bronx.
Now, was this part of the care through the Montefiore Medical Group?
Right. So it's a very interesting arrangement. So the departments, as pediatrics, internal medicine, family medicine, have their teaching practices that are embedded in the medical group. The medical group essentially is the umbrella that has the physical plant and the nurses and the ancillary services and the administration. And inside those practices are where the faculty from the various departments see their patients and teach their residents and medical students.
Now, the interesting thing is the Montefiore Medical Group was one of the earliest HMOs. I think it was the first HMO in the country. So.
Yes, so that dates back to 1948. And this was a very early incursion into the area of risk-taking on the part of the institution. And it was originally an arrangement with the city workers in the city of New York to take on risk for them and to be a prepaid group practice for them. And subsequently, over the years, it has grown enormously. It's expanded in terms of, obviously, the kinds of patients that are looked after and where it's situated.
Well, which relates to the ACO today, you know.
That's right. It's part of the architecture that Montefiore has put together over many years that enabled us, when the ACO legislation came about, to take advantage of it.
2012, what happens then?
So in 2012, the person who had been the chairman of pediatrics, Philip Oswa, is asked to take on the role of chief operating officer by Dr. Safir, who's the CEO. And so when Dr. Oswa decided to become the COO after a period of time, he asked would I be interested in taking on 2 positions. One is the chief medical officer, and the other is the executive director for the medical group. And anyone who knows Dr. Oswa knows how persuasive he can be.
So is
He's
Steve.
a very difficult individual to say no to.
Let's talk about the ACO and healthcare and Obamacare relating today in your roles. How do you, what are your involvement?
I think from the standpoint, and I'm talking for myself now, I'm not talking for Montefiore, but having lived and worked in that system for some period of time, I think what's happening is that there is a dawning realization in other parts of the country of something that has been known at Montefiore for some period of time. And that is that there is a better way to deliver healthcare than what we've been doing. That the fee-for-service model really is not long for this world. It has perverse incentives built into it. This is something that, as far back as Martin Cherkasky, and even before that at Montefiore, there was this realization. It took some time at Montefiore to put the architecture in place to be able to make the shift. And that architecture involves a bunch of different things. It involves a very robust ambulatory network. You can't do this work unless you have a large number of ambulatory primary care physicians who are taking care of large numbers of patients. That's the first thing. You also need all of the secondary, and that is the subspecialists and the tertiary infrastructure to support that primary care, because there are people, despite your best efforts, who are going to get ill and need that. So you need that part of it. But far and above that, you need a very robust IT infrastructure. You need to be able to marshal the information that comes out of your activity and format that information and analyze it and feed it back to the clinicians so that they know what it is that they're doing relative to where they want to be doing things. They know—
Which is part of the emergence of electronic medical records.
Yes, and Montefiore was very much in the forefront of that. We were very early on with computer order entry and a variety of other things. So that became also a very much an important part of the architecture here. Beyond that, though, you also need a group of people whose job is going to be to manage patient care outside the exam room. When people come out of the hospital, making sure that they're getting their medicines delivered to their homes, making sure that they're taking their medicines the right way. If they're having problems in between their office visits, being able to help them manage that. If they have issues with regard to social care issues or the pharmaceutical issues that they have. You need social workers and nurses and pharmacists, all of whom are designed to interface with patients to keep them well. That is part of the architecture as well. And the care management organization that's grown up over time at Montefiore is integral to being able to care for patients in this kind of a practice. In addition to that, we have a very large and robust home health visiting agency. So we have nurses that do, 500,000 visits a year out in various places in the Bronx and Lower Westchester. Again, extending the reach of the physicians in the exam room out to where patients are living.
Basically, in essence, and then I got to go to the family, is if you keep people healthy, you'll reduce your health care costs and you'll also help save lives.
Well, that's the conceit. That's the underlying conceit
Right.
of this. Now, you need to also be very large. You can't do this with 5,000 patients.
Right, but that's why you have today so many, your exposure in the hospitals. Tell me about how you met your wife and tell me about your two children.
Kathleen and I met in graduate school. She is an economist and she was taking courses at NYU at the time that I was. She's from Norway, and so we have, as you can imagine, robust conversations over the dinner table about a variety of different things with regard to life in the United States as it compares to other places in the world. We have two daughters, Emma, who's 25, and Sophie, who's 23.
And what is Emma doing?
Emma's beginning graduate school in clinical psychology. She also has a profound and abiding interest in children and their development, which maybe there is a genetic predisposition to that in our family.
DNA of you.
No.
And your other daughter?
And Sophie is right now working as an analyst at AIG. She actually has a particular interest in audiology and may be pursuing that at some point in the future, but right now she's very happy where she is at AIG.
So for the kid who grew up who was born in Washington Heights, who grew up in Great Neck, who spent time in Tanzania, who wanted to be a clown, who is one of the leading pediatric leaders around the country, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me here. It was a pleasure.